Welcome, Wargamers, to the god-tier scholastic book fairs of Ea, because today we are talking about the Scholae, a subfaction of the city-states that really exemplifies more of like the mystical, the magical, and the terrifying concepts both within, a faction, like the greater city-states faction, but also like setting-wide. There are some huge implications to what this particular subfaction is tinkering with, and we're going to talk all about the kind of dramatic things that have brought it to where it is, and how it fits into city-states and the greater Conquest lore. Now, one thing I want to add really quickly here is that if you are new to this game or interested in this faction, please consider using the affiliate link in my description down below. It'll save you 10% on anything store-wide, and it gives a tip to the channel at no cost, and I use that to support myself, my wife, this channel, all of its life-changing stuff, and I'm so thankful for all of you who do. For those of you who are new to Conquest or just learning about the city-states, the newest faction that was fully released by Bellum, we need some groundwork. Okay, I did a dedicated video going into like the general terms of city-states, but never the sub-factions. I'll leave that in the link down below, but I'm going to highlight just the very relevant parts because only certain of those kind of narrative threads really matter for the Scholae. So here's my synopsis. A couple of really smart people saw the writing on the wall about Scholae. Scholae being the god of humanity, this being of incredible and incalculable power that brought mankind from hunter-gatherer tribes to the city-states, and as well as not just the city-states, but then like the Old Dominion. All this technological, architectural, engineering, monuments, achievements, everything like that, civilization and culture, all of it is a guided effort by Scholae to ascend to higher levels of power. But for these this think tank, if you will, these group of nerds, they're sitting around looking at this whole thing going, that's not right. Like, if anything happens to Scholae, we're in a lot of trouble. And at the time, like, the fall of the Dominion wasn't like a singular event. I mean, it was and it wasn't. Like, there was a decline period before things actually went south. And so it's as this decline period is starting that these smart people are like, okay, wait a minute. So Scholae is the source of all this information, and we don't have much in the way of repositories. Like, if Scholae goes down, it's going to take humanity with it. And so these folks started to essentially build what I'm going to call an ark for humanity. Not necessarily like to physically remove themselves, although that was part of it. That's why the city-states are geographically in a different place than the Old Dominion. But this was an ark for knowledge. Scholae advanced them so far, but not enough of it was written down, recorded, disseminated, brought out of the Old Dominion. And so that desire is what really founded the city-states as a faction, repositories of human knowledge and culture and civilization. But again, this group of smart guys did not stop there. Because they didn't just see that Scholae was at some point going to go insane and take humanity with it. They actually studied Scholae and began to understand how the primordial powers work. We've talked about that in a little bit of detail when it comes to the various deities of the factions. Dwecom being a great one, that there are these primordial creators, just beings that are only, surmised by singular words, creation, war, etc. And so these people in the city-states started examining exactly how deities work. How bits of creation, capital C creation, like the deity kind of thing, can be revered and grown with worship. They can be cultivated. A consciousness can be developed. And so basically, what I put here in my notes, just to kind of surmise it, these dudes popped out of the Matrix. Like, I have been high, but I have never been, let's deconstruct the nature of the divine and start a playbook on how to wield it as a tool, kinda high. Because as we begin moving from city-states in general to talking about the Scholae in specific, this is really what that subfaction represents. That idea that the city-states was about deconstructing the divine and trying to understand it. Wielding divine power and worship as tools to serve humanity rather than enslave it like it ended up doing with Scholae. Because you have to understand, it takes several years to establish this as a faction. Like, these guys are just kind of hoarding knowledge somewhere else, but it does develop into trade and full-blown city-states as we know them now. And that whole time, things are getting worse and worse in the Old Dominion, and so they're like looking at what the possible fallout a deity level power could have, but also understanding that it's what brought him this far. So how can we use this? And so accumulating all their research, which I'm just going to throw a spoiler out there, a lot of it's lost. But here was the OG plan for the city-states, okay? And this is for all the city-states. We'll talk about why it really just reflects the Scholae here in a bit. But the plan was, one of these smart dudes would take on the mantle of Platon. And he would elevate his mind, essentially mantle a god of the state. Not worshipped, but honored. Now, here's kind of his idea, was like, we're going to take a shard of creation, we're going to imbue my brain into it, become, formless, if you will, a deity almost like Haslia, but very, very weak in comparison. And the idea was that he can then lead his people. We'll get into what the intention was, but essentially they wanted to take one of their own, elevate them to this deity level, and then just solely have this deity kind of govern and direct their society, not expanding into anything like Haslia. Not trying to be a god, not trying to like sway people from other religious worship, but just kind of like a member of the state. How this character known as Platon achieved this, that information was all lost. Because this part of the plan wasn't really meant to be saved. This is about creating a protector and a director of the city-states, and none of it's tested. This is all mad scientist level stuff, and if it kills the creator, well then, it might have just been a bad idea. The Old Dominion was falling apart towards this point in our story faster than expected. It was just kind of snowballing out of control. Famines led to riots, there was government systems falling down, Haslia wasn't responding or giving proper orders, it was all getting kind of fractured. And so in desperation, Platon rushed the production of his city-states and ascended. So even though it was the plan, this was all very hastily done in the last days. And when he stepped into this thing, he became incorporeal. His will, guidance, and influence permeating the chambers of his city, and at least initially, it was a success. There was a consciousness directing energy, it could receive praise, it could participate in, and very subtly influence the direction of this town. Once it seemed like he was pretty stable there, they then essentially broke his personality into several different pieces. Almost like how Haslia broke itself up into multiple pieces to have like a pantheon of gods. They're all subject to him, but it's these little bits of divinity that he can split off to kind of take their own, and then he can usurp their power at any time. Well, they did the exact same thing with Platon. They're like, well, we have a local guardian. We could split him up and then have like one of his essence in every city of the city-states. And that way, we're all at least on the same page in terms of moral guidance. So they tried this, and the early tests ended up being pretty positive. For example, like Platon was able to share information between the city-states really without having to have like writers or anything like that. So initially they're like, oh, this is working really, really well. Early on, he was able to facilitate growth, influence policy to keep everyone unified as the world around them collapsed from the fall of Haslia. But let me ask you this, what do you call a story where a madman ignores all safety warnings and just does what he does and there's no consequences? The answer is it's a boring story, because there's always consequences for this kind of stuff. You see, it turns out Platon doesn't divide very well, right? Haslia was a lot more powerful when he decided to do the same process. And where Haslia split into minor deities that still pointed towards him, they had their own cults and kind of faces towards the public. Well, sometimes these little bits of Platon, they would flicker. Like information would be lost, the communications breaking down. Sometimes unintentional or false orders can be issued. So all of a sudden, one of these city-states has their army mobilizing and the others don't. That gets real weird. They're not able to unify. Like, it just kind of fell apart. Initially it worked, but then the longer this experiment went on for, some of the city-states just weren't working because those little bits of Platon just didn't have enough fire in them. And it led to disunity. And remember, we're talking about how these people wield godhood as a tool. Okay, that's like their defining feature next to minotaurs. Well, this system depends on honoring the figure of Platon and moving in one direction, but when you start breeding chaos and disorder within that system, it starts to tear at the fundamental design behind having a central deity that you worship. or at least honor. And so the city-states as a truly cohesive body fell apart pretty fast after the fall. They of course still exist as a collective, like the 100 Kingdoms. Like they're much rather fight, next to each other than against any of the other many threats in Ea, but that doesn't mean they don't fight amongst themselves as well. But where we landed is very far from the original vision. Because it's not just that like some of these cities lost a little bit of guidance. Some of these things went way out of control. We're going to talk about the fallout now, which is my favorite part of this entire thing. You see, the division of Platon and the fallout from everything going around them in the setting with the fall of the Old Dominion, all of these things led to the creation of different kinds of city-states. The Scholae is a catch-all term about all of those cities that are still defined by the tech that we mentioned here, like people trying to harness the power of the divine for the protection and guidance of their cities. So while every city-state, could potentially have some remnants of this thing in their cities, we're specifically talking about those city-states where this is still the defining feature of them. That's what makes this subfaction unique. Now, when I say divinity is the defining factor, that does not mean that they are all good. Because on one side, you have places like the city called Palace, which is sort of like the default capital of the city-state, you could call it. It's a beacon of everything that Platon wanted the city-states to be. It's a place of reason and scientific achievement and civil engineering. They're out there storing, preserving, sharing humanity's cumulative knowledge under the watchful guidance of a being that is beyond politics and time, able to care for and prune his people. Again, that's the mission statement that everyone was on board for when we started this. But then their lore also mentions a few other places. Archaeron, Toria, and Lycaon, or Lycaon, I don't know how to pronounce that one. They all went down a very different path. You see, those little fragments of Platon gained a little bit too much sentience themselves, too much individuality, a thing that they were not meant to ever have. They were supposed to be part of a whole, not a singular mind, but as things fell apart, this is just what happened. Well, when these isolated bits of Platon kind of came to, so to speak, they realized what was going on, that they are basically a battery trapped inside of a city-state for an eternity, and some of them got real mad, right? Hating the yoke of their keepers. And so some of these little shards of creation became tyrant deities. Again, they can subtly influence and guide, and so all of a sudden, if one of those little shards of creation begins twisting to, say, reward people for blood sacrifices or something like that, things get real out of hand. Even if it's just general violence, it doesn't have to be like a whole economy based on sacrifice or anything like that. But you can see the uptick in violence and aggression in people in the city-states where the deity becomes more cogent and more isolated. But this puts them in a weird place because at this point, those city-states, like the deities that control them, I'm not going to call them Platon anymore because they're all corrupted and whatever, but they have become the very thing that the entire city-state project was built to avoid. This natural occurring order of power and magnitude and direction that is the science of deity, no longer being a tool to serve humanity, but rather its destroyer, its master. Which is, again, what's going on in the Old Dominion. And so I wanted to kind of taper this off before we jump into the why it is cool to kind of clarify. Rather than doing like one video with all three subfactions for these guys, I find them so compelling that I made them their own video because in every city-state, you're going to have this kind of fallout somewhere in their history. Like, whether they are Palace and things are working fine, everything's awesome, thumbs up all around, or you're in one of these cities where the god turns evil and kind of subjugates the people who made it. But then there's just a whole bunch of cities where the project just failed and those pieces of creation just didn't do anything. They're not major factors within how the city-state functions, although for every single one of them, it's part of their history. Like whether or not the bits and shards of Platon actually succeeded, every single one of them does have some little bit of history tied to the Scholae. And so let's break this down by talking what makes this story cool. What's cool about the Scholae? Well, it raises a whole lot of interesting ethical and philosophical questions here that I think are very compelling. It's one of the reasons I love this as a faction. I'm not sure I'm going to play them, but the models are insanely cool. Maybe one day. But here's a question for you. What is Platon's responsibility in the human suffering on display here? So, for example, Haslia was a natural occurring thing. It was a fluke accident. The Dweghom had captured a shard of creation, threw it in a locker, and they left. They actually got eradicated. Humans stumble into the remains, or ancient remains of a Dweghom forge, find the thing, and this unhealthy relationship starts with it. It's all innocent in a sense. But if you approach this situation of using, deity level power as a tool for humanity, and in doing so you create 3 little demigods that just ruin generations of people with torture, pain, bloodshed, all of this stuff. Just, again, human suffering and whatever that might look like. Well, how does that make you feel about Platon? Like, do the cities that fell apart, the ones we mentioned before, or not fell apart, but I guess turned dark, we'll say that, do they view him as a hero? Those shards of creation that they're run by don't seem to enjoy being alive, so I don't think it's a very healthy, thanks for having me kind of thought towards their parents. Because it's easy to say that, things are awesome, this is a cool idea if you're on the positive side. If you live in Palace, you're like, oh yeah, that guy Platon, that guy rules. If you live in literally any other city that's, like, not operating as intended originally, there's a lot of room to be like, this was a terrible idea. This is mankind dabbling with things we shouldn't do. This is Pandora's box, if you will. And I guess that's kind of my thing, is like, this could be viewed as Prometheus giving us fire, meaning a tool of the gods is brought to man and now we can become this next level thing. That's a way to view this. It's certainly what Platon wanted this to be. And the opposite view is it's Pandora's box and it curses all of us. It certainly cursed thousands of people of multiple generations from those city-states where it either failed to protect them or, in the worst case, in my opinion, turns into a mini tyrant of their own. And I love it, because this whole process that we're describing, one, it's not repeatable, so we don't have to constantly, it's not like the time turner from Harry Potter where you're like, oh, every situation will be solved by someone just becoming a god. And so while it's not repeatable, the understanding, the basic mechanics of the setting were laid bare to someone. And they made one heck of a try. But it creates some very compelling aftermath, which is really what I like. I like those kinds of things when it comes to a story arc because it's perfect fodder for motivations for both heroes and villains. A good person being raised in a society where a haywire deity, went full dark mode kind of a thing. One of those cities they mentioned before, Acheron, I think is one of them. Or a person understanding, like maybe they live in Palace, have always thought this was awesome stuff, and then seeing the dark aftermath of this, having to kind of question those things. These are fantastic bits for stories. And then I literally just put it in my notes here because I wasn't sure how to word this. I'm going to read it to you. Entire philosophical and moral discussions about making a god. This is absurd. Meaning, it just has so many implications it's hard to talk about, right? And then when you mix it with the idea of areas of science that we could study but shouldn't, and can mankind choose to not go down certain educational paths and stuff like that, all of those things, they're all great conversations and they're all made possible in the Scholae subfaction of the city-state. So friends, let me know your thoughts on these guys. I would love to hear them. What would your little baby tyrant be like? I say tyrant. They could be good or bad. I would just love to know. Do you want them to look more like Palace, the perfect side of things, or one of those other cities I mentioned where things got a little dark and heavy? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll catch you with you there. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.